Hi class, and welcome to the module on qualitative research. I'll start off by talking a little bit about what qualitative research is, and then talk a little bit about comparing and contrasting qualitative and quantitative research. I'll also talk a little bit about the article that I asked you to read, the Lyons et al. Article about social justice practice in qualitative research specifically. So when we think about qualitative research, there are a couple of quotes that I like that I think are pretty simple, straightforward ways of thinking about qualitative research. Your book, I think, also does a really nice job of laying out the different forms of qualitative research and some of the epistemological underpinnings of qualitative research. Auerbach and Silverstein say that qualitative research is research that involves analyzing and interpreting texts and interviews in order to discover meaningful patterns descriptive of a particular phenomenon. Typically what this means is that we are looking at words and not numbers. So we're asking people to talk about their experiences. We'll talk a little bit about the different ways in which we can collect qualitative data. But for the most part, we're analyzing words and not numbers in qualitative research. And qualitative research really began in sociology and anthropology during the 70s and 80s, really grew and developed in women's studies and in education studies. And today we think of it as one of the two dominant research paradigms, quantitative being one of them and qualitative being the other. And we conduct qualitative research for a variety of reasons. I really like this quote from Miles and Huberman. They say that qualitative data are sexy. They also say that qualitative data have a quality of undeniability. And they say that that's true because you have people actually telling you about their lived experience, and that gives the data a bit of undeniability. So if you have a score of 27, for example, on a particular scale, but then you have a person saying to you, here is what this means for me, this is how it looks in my life. There's a bit of undeniability to that because you have a very clear sense of what that means to that person and how they experience it, rather than having to do some interpretation about what a 27 on that scale means. Qualitative research also helps to provide some contextualization and can preserve chronological flow in people explaining series of events. As we'll talk a lot about in the Lyons article, and is mentioned a couple of times in the textbook chapter, there are opportunities to share power and to collaborate in qualitative research. There are also those opportunities in quantitative research, so I don't want to say that that's exclusively the domain of qualitative research, but because you're engaging in a bit more interaction often with participants in qualitative research, there is a bit more sharing of the power in particularly the data collection phase. Your book talks a lot about triangulation and various forms of triangulation that qualitative research can help us with to be able to have a little bit more certainty around our findings, clarity around our findings. Qualitative research can also be a place in which we can really develop our skills of reflexivity. Again, that's not solely the domain of qualitative research, but that's something that I think we should preserve in quantitative research as well. Qualitative research can either be theory building or theory testing. I think we tend to think of it more as theory building in a sort of grounded theory approach, but it can also be theory testing, so it has some flexibility to it. And I would say one of the key features of qualitative research is that we can really get a better sense of the meaning that people make of their behavior, other people's behavior, events, etc. Qualitative research can be really useful in informing implementation, so implementation of interventions, educational programs, etc. They can really give us a much better sense of acceptability and give us some really good insight into ways in which we can adapt or change the implementation process. They can also help us in evaluation research, which we'll talk a little bit more about in Module 6, I believe it is. And your book talks a lot about how qualitative research is particularly strong at the point of exploration in exploring a new research topic or exploring it in a different way. So I assigned the Lyons article to go along with the reading in your textbook because I think they bring up a lot of really nice principles about how to do social justice both in and via qualitative research. And I would just, the article mentions this, but I would just really highlight that social justice is not exclusive to qualitative research. Many of these principles are things that we can and should be doing in quantitative research as well. But the article focuses specifically on the confluence of social justice practices with some of the principles of qualitative research and talks about how those line up really nicely with one another. And I like this article specifically because they are very concrete, and I love concrete practical steps. They're very concrete about the ways in which social justice can and should play out at every step of the research process. They have a nice neat table, table 1 in the article, which I think gives a nice overview of the ways in which their 4 components they think of social justice, so access, participation, harmony, and equity, the ways in which those play out at the 4 stages of the research process that they identify. So the first is design, sort of more of the development and preparation phase of the research process. And they talk a lot about participatory action research. I don't think they quite use the CBPR language, but that's essentially what they're talking about. So community-based participatory research, and both of those really mean involving research participants in a very meaningful way in the research process. So having them inform the development of the research, the design of the research, the very questions that we ask in a research project. And they really speak to also developing a team that is diverse and inclusive of a range of perspectives and voices to really help bring some insider voice to that conversation. And then in data collection, which I think is where we traditionally think of social justice perhaps playing out in our research in that very concrete step of the actual engagement with participants, with usually a bigger number of participants. And I like that they've situated the data collection piece as just one part of this process. But in data collection, again, that team diversity and inclusion is really important. They also talk about cultural competence or multicultural competence, which I think is a great thing. I know a lot of people have issues with the term competence because it feels like such a sort of base level of, you know, I'm not screwing up, so therefore I am competent. But sort of multicultural competence and being able to work with communities and participants in ways that are culturally relevant and sensitive and appropriate for them. To really give some meaning to the participation in the research, both in a recruitment phase as well as in data collection phases. And I think that concept of meaningful participation is one that I really like that language around to really flow with the idea of making meaning via qualitative research, but also bringing that meaning and helping our participants to connect with our research in a way that is potentially meaningful to them. And another thing that they mentioned that I really like in this data collection phase is the piece about consent being sort of an ongoing process, that it doesn't just end when they sign the consent form or provide whatever form of consent we're asking them for, but it's really an ongoing process and a negotiation with the researchers and the participants. The next piece that they talk about is data analysis and interpretation. This again is where the team diversity and inclusion comes into the process. I'm really thinking about how to bring resources or attention in some good way or some positive way to your research community via those findings. And so this is also a place where that multicultural competence comes in to be able to understand the community, to be able to think about the ways in which these results will impact and speak to individuals' experiences. They talk about member checks in this section of the article, which is a pretty common practice, and your book talks a bit about that as well. And then they talk about application as well, and I haven't included that here because we're going to talk more about that when we talk about community-based participatory research in the next module. But really thinking about the utility of a project and how we apply the results. So who has access to the application of those results? And some of these things you're probably looking at them and thinking about their relation to the basic principles that we talked about when we were talking about ethics in research. And so some of those really basic principles of justice and beneficence, you see those strings coming through in this component of the research. And so I think that's, this piece of it is really taking that ethical component seriously, particularly the justice component of research, really taking that seriously and prioritizing that and being really intentional in our research process. So I hope you all enjoyed that article. Feel free to post on message board if you have comments or thoughts about the article. I would love to hear them. And I think it's worth sort of picking up again on some of the tensions potentially between qualitative and quantitative research. Your book has a table, I think it's table 8.1, I think I have it written here later, to really think about some of the connections between the principles that we really hold dear in quantitative research and those companion principles in qualitative research. So scientific objectivity is one of the things that we think about a lot as a scientist. And this refers to this idea that we eliminate personal biases or a priori commitments, emotional involvement, attachment to the outcomes of a study in our process. And objectivity is often attributed to this property of scientific measurement that we do via, using scales and different measures as indicators of constructs that we're interested in. And we believe that the accuracy of a measure can be tested independent from the individual scientist who first developed or reported it. And so in qualitative research, we try and be explicit in exactly how we measured, what questions we asked, and in interpretation to acknowledge rival conclusions that one could make based on our data. And so we see some parallels of those ideas or those principles in qualitative and quantitative research. But I also think it's really important to really prioritize that reflexivity component of this, because I think probably most of you in this program have a pretty good sense of the ways in which personal biases can influence our operation, our behavior, our conclusions, our interpretations of the world at all levels. And so even in quantitative research, we'll never really obtain complete objectivity. Validity is also a concept that we talked about in relation to quantitative research. In qualitative research, we talk about parallels to the quantitative notions of validity in making sure we're linking our data to theory, to larger constructs, that we have some internal coherence in the stories and the meanings that we're hearing within our sample of participants. We also talk about generalizability and external validity in quantitative research. In qualitative research, we want to make sure that we're really clear about the bounds of generalizability. In quantitative research, we want to do that as well, and making sure that we're relating our findings to previous research and to previous theory. The table talks a little bit about sample size and saturation. In quantitative research, that sample size is really important because of the assumptions and limits of the data analysis techniques that we'll be using. In qualitative research, we think a little bit more about saturation. So are we hearing the same things over and over, or are we still drawing in wildly different perspectives and ways of thinking about this thing that we're looking at? So check out table 8.1. It does a nice overview of the parallels between these constructs in quantitative and qualitative research. But I really think what's important for me, anyway, is to think about the appropriateness of a qualitative versus a quantitative approach. I really like this quote. Elliot Eisner said, "What most radically distinguishes qualitative from quantitative inquiry is not that the former attends to qualities and the latter does not. They both do. What most sharply differentiates them is how they choose to inform the world about what they have seen. One approach is superior to the other, but only with respect to the nature of the problem one chooses to investigate." So this goes back to my harping on this basic idea that everything should flow from our research questions. So what are our research questions? What's the purpose of the research? And is quantitative research more appropriate? So which is the approach that is most appropriate to our question, to our framework and our goals? And how do we make sure that we're tying all of those together? So again, I think I talked in the beginning of the semester about being very much a pragmatist when it comes to my approach to research. And I think that comes through in my attachment to this particular quote, that both approaches are potentially superior to one another, but only in regards to the way in which they deal with a particular situation. So I'll talk a little bit more about research design and data analysis. In this section, this chapter in the book doesn't really get all that deeply into data analysis, but for those of you who are interested, there is another chapter later in the book that deals a little bit more in detail with qualitative data analysis. Much of what you'll see in social science research will likely be interviews or focus groups. Interviews can come in a few different forms. They can be semi-structured, really completely structured, sort of more of like a clinical diagnostic kind of an interview, or very unstructured, such as tell me your life story, tell me all about your sexuality. That would be a very unstructured interview where you would just let people go and see what direction they went and follow that direction. In a semi-structured interview, you usually have a series of questions. People can go in different directions potentially with the different questions, but you also often have very specific things that you're looking to cover in that interview. Focus groups, on the other hand, are similar to interviews in some ways, but they are groups of people. That's called focus groups. And these can be really great when you are particularly interested in the ways in which people interact with one another around a particular topic. So do they disagree with one another? Do they clarify? Will you be able to see certain distinctions that you're interested in ways that you might not be able to do without the focus groups? Focus groups are pretty commonly used in social science research. You probably also know about them from marketing research, which is a big area in which you'll see focus groups. And then some sort of lesser known or perhaps less often used methods are more of the ethnographic methods, so participant observation, different kinds of ethnography, and those can be particularly important when you're taking a step back even further in the sort of mesomicrosystems to really look at how social groups are structured and how they interact with one another. I've done some ethnography with a colleague who was interested in different social scenes in New York City. And so I supervised a team of ethnographers who went to hip-hop clubs, gay bars, lesbian bars, indie rock scenes, electronic dance music scenes, EDM scenes, and really tried to describe the scene more broadly. So what people were wearing, how they were interacting, were they drinking, were there talks of drugs, what did the space look like, things like that. So that can help really get a better sense of sort of larger social structures in some ways, as well as some of the individual interactions and meanings that people make of certain scenarios. Table 8.4 in your book gives a really nice overview of each of these different methods of data collection. In qualitative data analysis, one of the interesting things I think that is a mistake in thinking about qualitative data analysis is that because it's not numbers, because it's not math, it's easy. It's just words, you just have to look at what people say. And I think this is a mistaken sense of how labor-intensive and involved qualitative data analysis can be. Qualitative data analysis is often iterative and very interactive. When I say iterative, I mean that you may go through, let's say you did 30 interviews, you go through all 30 of them, you do an initial round of coding perhaps, and then you're going back through them over and over and over again and refining that process and going back to the literature and coming back to your data and talking to other people about how they're interpreting things and what they're seeing as patterns. It often involves reading for layers of meaning and not just sort of what's on the surface of what people are saying, looking for patterns both within and across cases or across people. And all of our data analysis stems from theoretical perspectives and contexts, knowledge, discipline-specific knowledge that we bring to the research. So even in a method of data analysis like grounded theory, which is really using the data to develop theory, to develop hypotheses, we have knowledge that we're bringing to that situation. We have knowledge of theories, of these communities, hopefully, of the topic that we are studying. And so even if we are trying to use the data from a very bottom-up approach, we do bring that knowledge to our data analysis. And there are a variety of individual qualitative data analysis strategies that can be combined, but again, always informed by your research questions, your design, your beliefs, your prior work, etc. So again, qualitative data analysis is a very labor-intensive process. For those of you who are interested in more information about that, Chapter 16 is a great overview of qualitative data analysis specifically. And I'll talk a little bit more about reflexivity. It's a way to help you critically analyze the research process and your data analysis. And so questions you could ask yourself are, what's your relationship to the participants in your study? What are your reactions to them, and what are their reactions to you? And really examining your personal and your theoretical premises to understand how they are informing the ways in which you're generating data, the ways in which you behave or interact with participants, or they behave and interact with you. They inform the way that we develop interpretations of data, and then how we use these data to develop our own theories. And again, this is something we should be doing in quantitative research as well. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about mixed methods research, which is the use of both qualitative and quantitative methods in a single study, or sometimes in series of studies. So as I think I've hopefully gotten across, different methods have different strengths and are appropriate for different kinds of questions. Integrating them effectively is somewhat complex, and I think also labor intensive. But it's really important in this process to really create a careful connection between why you're doing qualitative research and why you're doing quantitative research, and between those methods and designs, to make sure that you're suiting all of the purposes that you've laid out for that research. So really connecting and linking those purposes and methods at every step of the process. And often people think about using qualitative and quantitative in either sequential or simultaneous ways. So simultaneous would be that you're collecting both qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. Sequential would be that you're doing one in front of the other, and maybe moving back and forth. So maybe you start with a qualitative study, you use that to inform the design of a quantitative study, and then you conduct another qualitative study to follow up on the results of that quantitative research. And so there are lots of reasons to combine these methods, and those reasons should inform how you lay out the use of those methods. So in connected contributions, the goal is to use the strengths of one method to enhance the performance of another method. This is typically sequential. So each method serves a different purpose. It's kind of what I described a bit before. And you're using each method to build on what you learned from the other. In convergent findings, you may be utilizing both methods to address the exact same research question, maybe just worded a little bit differently, to see if those results are similar. So this would be a situation in which we're using this for triangulation. That could happen a bit more simultaneously, or it could also be sequential. And then sort of complementary coverage is where we utilize both methods to study separate parts of an overall project. So we may be able to match the strengths of each of those methods or paradigms to the purpose or the sets of purposes that we may have in a particular research study. So this could be a situation in which it's either sequential or simultaneous in terms of data collection and the way we're laying out projects or a project. But this is a situation in which we're looking maybe at different aspects that require different kinds of methods to be able to answer those questions or meet the aims. So the basic take-home message that I would like for you to pull from this section on qualitative data, or qualitative research more broadly, is that every successful research project requires two things: a meaningful research question and an appropriate way to answer that question. That I feel like is my take-home message a lot of lectures. So deciding how to do your research in terms of design really depends on your very clear understanding of why you're doing that research. So the purpose and the kinds of questions that you're asking, and then your strategy or approach to research more broadly. And research design is the process of choosing a way to answer your research questions. So you need to know what your options are. So that goes back to that toolbox analogy that I used at the beginning of the semester. So knowing what those options are and knowing how to evaluate them, knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each of those options, and knowing which of those strengths and weaknesses are most important to you, or the ones that you can sort of take the hit on in terms of weaknesses. So that's my very pragmatist approach to qualitative research. And the social justice theme that I think we should think about taking as we do research more broadly, but perhaps particularly well suited to qualitative research. So if you have questions, thoughts, post those under the general discussion forum, and I will do my best to answer them. All right, thanks all.